A gentleman in the long taxi queue at the airport quoted an American president to me and said that Washington, and I don't know how many native Washingtonians there are here, but said that Washington combines the efficiency of the South and the charm of the North. And as a non-American, since an American told me the joke, I also had a laugh.
It's true.
I will say that as I was dropped off at the front here, waves of school children, coming doing their tour of the capital, and I was of course reminded of my own sorts of things doing that in Canberra, which is a similar, governmental capital. And what it made me reflect briefly is that, democracy doesn't happen automatically. Human rights doesn't happen automatically. Freedoms don't happen automatically. We have to learn them, and we have to keep learning them, and we have to keep building a belief in them and a commitment to them among the young, among our politicians. We have to keep reminding our politicians of all stripes and of all generations continually for this. So I want to thank all of you and the people that you represent in your home communities for continuing to build the energy of democracy, of individual freedoms, of community freedoms, that underpin those sort of universal values that I think are at the essence of the relationship between the USA and the United Nations. And I think that's one of the fundamental strengths of the United States engagement with the United Nations, is that the citizenship believes in the same values that underpin the fundamentals of the United Nations. So I just I sort of put a few things together as I saw the kids lining up. Actually, what I would like to do is speak for about 10 or 15 minutes only, and then have a dialogue if we could. I'll just put my clock up there, because I'm much more interested to know with what you're interested in, where you're coming from, what you'd like to hear from me. But perhaps I'll just put out a few markers in relation to United Nations peacekeeping that might prompt a few thoughts, provoke some questions, and so on. First of all, I can see friends from Kansas City, and I want to give a shout out, I think you call it, yeah? Because I visited recently to Kansas City and the Truman Library, to the UN Association there. It was really, very well looked after, and it was a really terrific visit. So I can see friendly faces, and I can see a lot of friendly faces, but I can see friendly faces that I know. President Truman, actually, as I was, preparing to talk at his library, his commemorative library, I mean, he was, of course, one of the fundamental architects of the United Nations, which grew from the scourge of war, as the UN Charter says. And he described the United Nations as a partnership among the peoples of the world for their common peace and common well-being. And again, that theme of the peoples of the world, you are at the people's community level driving your country's engagement with the UN. And again, I just acknowledge that, and I think that that's, again, a fundamental strength and a necessity to keep governments engaged in the UN and to keep the UN engaged with people in all countries of the world. When I talk about the fundamental values of the UN, and I think of the US, not being a US citizen, but what I see and observe, I talk about things like human rights and protecting the most vulnerable people in the world. I talk about supporting democratic development where it needs support. And I talk about promoting equality for all, especially for women and girls in societies where that is not an easy thing. There's some of the fundamentals where I've experienced that people in the United States get it in their heart, they get it in their DNA, that this is really important, and that it is a responsibility of a citizen in your own country and as a global citizen to reach out and help build support for those fundamental values in practical ways. The United Nations, it's not a group of professors sitting in New York at headquarters in some secretariat dreaming up world peace. It is fundamentally a field-based organisation spread around the whole world, doing practical work in countries where it's most needed. That's really the fundamental of the UN, and it's grown into that in more than 65 years since it's been in existence. And that is fundamentally addressing needs that are there. We see humanitarian agencies, we see development agencies, we see human rights monitors and field presences, we see conflict prevention and mediation, we see peacekeeping and peace building. So today I want to focus on peacekeeping. That's what I do these days. Though I have also worked in the human rights field within peacekeeping and political missions, and as a political and civil affairs type officer in the grassroots. So they all connect up. All these presences do connect up. Peacekeeping, interestingly, was never mentioned in the United Nations Charter. It had no mention, but it's been around for more than 65 years now. So it was actually a very early invention of the United Nations, again responding to a practical and fundamental need, and again the scourge of war, to end the scourge of war. And so, interestingly, that it wasn't written into the Charter, our history is actually based in innovation and adaptation. There are needs, we meet them. We can't always predict what those needs are going to be, and so we have to be flexible, we have to be nimble, and we have to be responsive to what the world demands of us. The early peacekeeping missions tended to be relatively straightforward affairs, tended to be monitoring ceasefires between standing armies, which usually came from individual countries. That was the nature of conflict, by and large, of armed conflict, by and large. Over time, and we still have some of those missions, in fact, we still have a mission in Kashmir. More than 60 years it's been there. We still have a mission in Cyprus, monitoring a ceasefire between Greece and Turkey. It's been there more than 45 years. We call those sometimes the frozen conflicts. It's not the job of those missions to solve the politics, but it is the job of those missions to help prevent the flaring up again of fighting while others work out the politics. But the politics can take a long time. At the end of the Cold War, you'll know as well as I that conflict sort of went through a change. What we saw in some respects was no less amount of conflict, but a conflict that was often fought inside countries, whether we call that internal conflict, civil wars, armed elements. But what we saw was often devastating conflicts, many times fought over long periods of time, and at the grassroots level, at the community level, engulfing communities. Peacekeeping had to respond to this in a way where we found ourselves moving into many countries where the social fabric had been shattered, where the governance fabric had been shattered, and it wasn't simply a matter of standing between two armies. Sometimes the combatants were very hard to even identify. Fragile peace agreements, sometimes barely a peace to keep, but helping to rebuild countries from the bottom up became a fundamental need. And that's where we developed what we called multidimensional peacekeeping in the 90s and then particularly early 2000s, where I would say, and certainly Ambassador Susan Rice has recognised this in speeches, one of the strengths of United Nations peacekeeping is this multidimensional nature where it involves military, police and civilian components. It's not purely a military activity. When we say peacekeeper, we mean the whole gamut. And among civilians, we have human rights officers, political affairs officers, grassroots civil affairs officers who work at the grassroots community level, women's protection officers, child protection officers, all manner of specialties who work with local actors to strengthen both elements of the democratic institutions but also the social fabric, to work with humanitarian actors and so on. One of the things that happened post-Cold War was that when we walked into these devastated countries, almost always, there was a massive humanitarian crisis at the same time. The conflict had caused a massive humanitarian conflict, massive humanitarian disaster. Think about Eastern Congo and the Great Lakes region of Africa. 5 million people died there. 5 million civilians died in that region. Less than 10 years ago that ended. We still have major problems there. We still have armed groups which are marauding across eastern Congo. Sexual violence is very much a weapon used against village communities and women. And massive displacement occurred when 5 million people were killed over time. Massive human displacement. And it's easy to say the word displacement, but you have to imagine, and you see those images of families, carrying whatever belongings they can on their heads, on their shoulders, with babies wrapped up in them, just trying to survive, trying to live for another day and hope that things can be stabilised around them and that they can be protected. That's the kind of environment that we found ourselves walking into, that we find ourselves still working on in eastern Congo, in South Sudan, where there are a lot of still communal violence problems and a lot of displacement, and then a large humanitarian operation around that. So one of the things that peacekeeping does is keep the space open for civilian humanitarian actors to deliver, because they need security in order to help people with their basic needs, to eat enough, to have shelter, and to have basic medical care. So the multidimensional element really came in. A thing that's developed more in the last 5, 6, 7 years, it's always been at the heart of what we do, but it's been expressed more clearly. Interestingly, I think the United States administration has been very strong at helping us develop our thinking around this and develop our practical concepts around this, and that's protection of civilians, which is a military business, but it's also a civilian business. It's always the fundamental responsibility of the host country to protect its citizens, but it's also more and more a fundamental core of our peacekeeping operations, to protect the most vulnerable civilians. And we see that again in Congo. It's a fundamental issue in South Sudan, in Darfur. It has been in Côte d'Ivoire. So this is it's an emerging area of work too, where again, civil affairs officers, human rights officers, gender protection officers, women's protection officers, child protection officers work with local governments, work with community groups. In South Sudan, for example, early warning is a major element of this, so that we understand the dynamic of what is going on, and we're able to help governments get their citizens out of harm's way. So if it comes to it, it's our job to stand between those who would attack civilians and protect them, but a large part of the protection needs to be to make sure those who would harm them don't get to them. So protection of civilians is a very large focus of peacekeeping these days. Another element that's emerged in the last decade, and even more in the last couple of years, is we are being asked to go into more and more challenging environments, more and more risky environments. I just came back from Mali 10 days ago, helping to design our new mission there. And the mission is in existence, but on 1 July, formally, African soldiers from the West African Association, ECOWAS, will be what we call rehatted. They'll take off their ECOWAS helmets and they'll put on their blue helmets. And then officially they're UN peacekeepers. This is an interesting example of how war can happen these days and how conflict can happen. In a really simple nutshell, you had the Libyan regime falling, where many people from Mali had worked with that regime as security people. Large amounts of weapons left Libya as that regime was falling, travelled back into Mali. There was already a sort of transnational narco-criminal network operating from Latin America, entering through West Africa into a largely ungoverned area and moving drugs up into Europe. So you had transnational crime with a lot of money. You had an influx of weapons with the fall of a regime. You had a weakly governed state, which happens to be one of the poorest countries in the world. Poverty and conflict happen together so often. And the combination of that was toxic. You had a weak government, you had a coup, a military coup, you had a genuine ethnic marginalisation and political grievances thrown into then a terrorist jihadist opportunism that also came with the fall of the regime in Libya. So you had narco-trafficking, transnational big money, you had a genuine internal political grievance and marginalisation, you had jihadist, cross-border terrorism, poorly governed country, poverty, mayhem. The French went in very quickly and pushed back the jihadists so they didn't take over the capital. The African countries in the neighbouring area, what we call ECOWAS, quickly mobilised with the UN security mandate to come in behind the French fighting troops. But to sustain this and really the mix of issues is so fundamental that it's going to take time and have to be addressed on many levels. The Security Council decided there need to be a more stable peacekeeping operation, United Nations, and so we're establishing there. But that's going to need to address fundamental political issues of inclusion, a restoration of not just democracy but the constitutional order, remembering there was a military coup, and help the Malians themselves build an inclusivity that will help secure their state. All in extremely challenging physical circumstances. The deserts in the north, it was 50 degrees Celsius, so it's 120 something, and we weren't at peak temperatures. Too hot to fly helicopters at some times of the year in some parts of the country, and you can't get around any other way. So unless you're a camel. So this is where we're going to next. This is where we're heading next, and it's possible that in the coming year or a little more, Somalia may yet become a blue helmeted mission. The African Union has troops there now who've been fighting. I mean, remember we're peacekeeping. There needs to be an element of peace to keep. The United Nations doesn't send troops in to fight. Though I'll give you a little interesting development on that in a moment too. But Somalia may yet become a blue helmeted stabilisation mission in time to come, which is a great thing for Somalia if it's able to move to that level. And the progress politically in Somalia and security-wise in the last 18 months has been extraordinary. Supported by UN political officers and supported by my other department, the Field Support Department, which logistically supports the African troops to do their work. Syria is a country where the United Nations Arab League Joint Envoy Lakhdar Brahimi has flagged that there may need to be a robust peacekeeping mission in the future. It's too soon, it's too early to say what that would be, but internally we're planning. We have to have contingency plans because if the day after comes there, we will need to move quickly. Now, all of this adds up to peacekeeping, which is reaching absolute historical peak demand. We have about 115,000 peacekeepers in the field today, 15 missions. Already with Mali coming online, that will put us at, I think, the highest numbers we've ever been historically. And certainly if these other missions were to come about, we would be at that level. That places a lot of demand on us for resources, which is actually a demand on our member states. The United States pays 27% of the peacekeeping bill, so it's a fundamental supporter. The United States doesn't have large numbers of troops or police, just over 100. Though, interestingly, in the last year, a very senior military officer joined the mission in Liberia, which was the first sort of senior level return of a US military man for some time. He's the military chief of staff there. And interestingly, Susan Rice has flagged the US's willingness to consider the placement of more military advisors and police advisors, and particularly women. One of the things we struggle with is to increase our numbers of women police officers and military. We have a target. 4 or 5 years ago, we had 2%, 1 or 2% of police officers were women. We've raised that to 10%. We want to get it to 20% by 2015. But the UN peacekeeping does not have its own soldiers. It does not have its own police. Our member states provide troops and provide police, usually on a 12-month rotation, sometimes on a 6-month rotation. So there's no standing UN force. Peacekeeping is as good or as bad as our member states allow us to be. The US does provide a lot of other kinds of support in training. We've been doing some tabletop planning exercises around the contingencies to protect civilians in South Sudan and also in Mali, only in the last week or so, with top US planners. So they bring, one of the key things the US brings to the table for us is, of course, the highly developed experience that it has and very strong policy input. One of the things, and I mentioned this when I was in Kansas, that I really like about my engagement with the US State Department and others is that they're very demanding. They don't take, woolly answers for things, and they shouldn't. Member states shouldn't. But they're not demanding and then do nothing. I mean, if you're going to be demanding, you need to bring support to the table. And I find that what we have is a very constructive engagement where they want us to be better and they're bringing some things to that table. I think they could bring more. I think this great country has a lot of different resources, but I think the engagement's a very positive one, and I think that people in your positions, first of all, we need you to keep impressing upon your elected representatives to stay engaged. We know that some are very sceptical of the UN. I think some have, frankly, either old-fashioned or views or kind of locked-in views that are not necessarily informed about all the different things that we're doing. And I think that you can help bring that message to them. But then to those who are more open is, well, what more could we do? What more could we do as Americans and as the US to make this work better? Because one thing that we'll say is we go to places that no one else will go, that no one wants to or can go. Sometimes politically, because the UN is the only acknowledged impartial body with the legitimacy to do that. Sometimes because they're conflicts that individual countries just don't want to have to get engaged in or bogged down in. The UN presence in Haiti means that the US doesn't need to be there unilaterally. The US is very engaged in issues like South Sudan and the Democratic Republic of Congo, but doesn't want to have to be there unilaterally and couldn't politically sustain that. And one of the things that Susan Rice says is that peacekeeping is good value on the dollar. There was a study done in Haiti that shows that it costs about 1/8 of the cost to have a UN peacekeeper in the field compared to a US peacekeeper in the field doing it unilaterally under the US military system. That's a military peacekeeper. So, she says Americans pay 27 cents in the dollar for UN peacekeeping, but the value compared to if the US were trying to do this unilaterally, which it couldn't sustain globally anyway, and wouldn't want to sustain globally anyway, is good value. And I think that's a good message to bring. I think that the other thing just to say is that we are continuing to work on administrative and financial reforms. One of the things that's happened in the last decade with the expanse of the demand for us to set up these operations is that we're setting up regional and global support centres so that if you think about our missions in Africa, Democratic Republic of Congo, Darfur, South Sudan, Somalia, all within a certain geographical area, we've set up a big logistics base in Entebbe, Uganda, right in the heart of that area, which supports all of those missions. Saved tens of millions of dollars on air flights by running a joint fleet rather than each one of those missions having its own operations. Centralised, finance officers and human resource officers and IT backup and those things. So we're getting better at being more efficient, at having more modern business systems, and the US is both demanding on us on that, but also very supportive of that, and that's something we need to demonstrate as well, I think, to elected representatives, that we hear the need for more efficiency, especially in times of belt tightening for governments, for families, The US has felt that very, very hard in the last few years. We are committed to demonstrating that, and we are achieving results there. So that's just another message to give. I think I should end there for now, just to say we had the International Day of United Nations Peacekeepers last week. We have a global theme every year, and the theme this year was adapting to new challenges. And that is that whole point of the conditions on the ground keep changing, the demands that are putting us into new mandate roles, particularly protecting civilians in extremely harsh conditions, situations where we're the target, often, situations like Mali where we know jihadists and terrorists will continue and possibly target us. So continually adapting, changing, being flexible, and being ready and on call as the world community calls on us to do the job. So that was the theme. And then as I close, just to say that we remembered our fallen colleagues each year on our International Day of United Nations Peacekeepers. In 2012, we lost 111 colleagues, civilians, police, military. Not all in combat or not all in attacks, but many died in attacks on us. Some died of illnesses and diseases. We work in pretty harsh conditions with pretty basic medical facilities in many cases too. So, we remember those and we honour those by continuing to work for what they sacrificed for. So I just sort of make that comment to end, and please let's have a dialogue.